In this, in my response to Chris's opening statement, I'm going to be keeping my comments focused on 3 different areas. Okay, the first area that I'm really going to address is where Chris really misrepresented my view. He did misrepresent it, but it might have been because of a misunderstanding. I'm going to trust that it was simply because of misunderstanding and not an intentional misrepresentation. Okay, so number 1, I'm going to address a misrepresentation of my position. Number 2, I'm going to talk about the nature of the definition of the sovereignty of God, because it would seem that Chris is trying to control the playing field, so to speak, in limiting even possible definitions of the sovereignty of God. That's the second thing. And then thirdly, I'm going to address the idea and the concept of God absolutely controlling all things or causing all things. Now, fortunately, Chris did take the time, as I had anticipated, he did take the time to establish many of the points that I made in my opening statement. I affirmed many of the things that he said. Nice thing is that he gave the biblical references for those things, and I trusted that he would do that. And interestingly enough, which may be a surprise to many, a lot of what he said I agree with. I agree with a large percentage of what he says. Okay, but definitely we still do have a definite misunderstanding, or we see things differently. Okay, now first of all, starting with the first thing then, he says this at about 1 minute and 30 seconds. Okay, about 1 minute and 30 seconds into it, he says the following. He says, all too often I've heard people suggest that God is so sovereign that he can give up his sovereignty in order to give man free will. As a matter of fact, my opponent said this to me in the comments of one of my videos, and he quotes a comment. This is the comment that got the whole thing started, or one of them anyways. He says, what if God, and this is me commenting on one of his videos, what if God wanted to exercise his sovereignty in a way that he sovereignly chooses to allow certain things to happen that he's not pleased with, or that is not his will? Then he goes on in his opening statement and says, what these people fail to understand is that sovereignty is an attribute of God. Therefore, what these people are asking when they ask, can God give up his sovereignty, is to ask, can God stop being God? Okay, let me just clarify something. At no point did I ever suggest, or at no point have I ever believed in or suggested that God in his sovereignty can give up his sovereignty. That's not my position, and that wasn't my question. My question was this: can God exercise his sovereignty in such a way to allow certain things to happen? There's a big difference right there. Okay, and I understand that there are some people that actually do believe that. That's not my position. Let me just state very clearly what I did say, because I didn't say, is God so sovereign that he can stop being sovereign? I agree with Chris. God can't, the sovereignty of God is just within his nature. He can't give up being sovereign any more than he can give up being holy. Okay, so I agree with him there. My question was this: what if God wanted to exercise his sovereignty in a way that he sovereignly chooses to allow certain things to happen that he is not pleased with, or that is not his will? So the question is, it's a question of how he exercises his authority. You see, we're all starting from the same place here, that God is sovereign. Now that we know that God is sovereign, that we agree that God is sovereign, the question is, how is he sovereign? So we go to the Bible. There goes the phone again. I got to unplug that thing. Apologies. So, so the question is, so we go to the Bible to find out what the Bible tells us, how he exercises his sovereignty. God determines how he is sovereign. Now, part of this is really getting mixed up with something that Calvinists often have a tendency to do. And what that is this: they will fail to see that God can be sovereign in that way. And they'll try to take that very definition off of the table. And by the way, this is a form of debate that's often employed in debate, but that Calvinists will use. Okay, and what that is this: they'll try to take the center of the field in such a way to eliminate certain definitions from even being possible. Let me explain it this way, and this is going on to my second point, and this is what I'm going to be quoting from part of his opening statement. And this is starting at about 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He says, I'm sure that many of you who would disagree with my position would state, hold on now, Chris, you are claiming that those who do not hold to your brand of sovereignty do not believe that God is sovereign. This is not true. We do believe that God is sovereign. We simply do not agree with your understanding of sovereignty. Now let me pause. There we go. Now Chris has anticipating an objection right there, and now he's correct there. He's correct in that anticipation. There were some things that he anticipated in his opening statement that weren't correct anticipations. He anticipated, perhaps, it seems that he had anticipated, if not me, then the minds of some, that some would call on a dictionary definition, or some would call on the utilizing the analogy of America as a sovereign state. I didn't do those things. This is a correct anticipation. I believe this. Let me say this again. This is not true. We do believe that God is sovereign. We simply do not agree with your understanding of sovereignty. And this is how Chris responds to this. To this I respond. Would you agree with that kind of argument from a Muslim that states we do believe in God, we just don't believe in your version of God? Or the Mormon that would suggest that we do believe in the Trinity, we just don't believe in your understanding of the Trinity? So his question is, would you accept that line of argumentation? Well, quite frankly, yes, I would. Of course I would accept that line of argumentation. I mean, doesn't that kind of go without saying? Because, you know, Muslims, they're theists, you know. Muslims are theists. They believe in God. Just so happens they have an incorrect understanding of God. Okay? But it wouldn't be right just to say, okay, well, you know, you're atheists. You know, you don't believe in, you're not Christians, so that means that you're atheists. No, that wouldn't be correct. Similarly with Mormons. However, I think that it would be more appropriate to utilize as an example. And by the way, let me just point something out here. Other people, like I was mentioning, other Calvinists will have a tendency to do this too. They'll try to control the debate. In just the same way, and I don't know if I use this analogy, but in just the same way that a chess player will try to control the center of the board, so too Calvinists will try to control the parameters of the debate by saying, listen, if you don't believe in this in sovereignty in this way, then that's just simply not sovereignty. Well, if they succeed in doing that, then the debate is over. But the fact of the matter is, the debate isn't over, because that is the very essence of the debate that we're talking about. That's at the core of the debate. That's at the core of the discussion. As a further example of this, of course, we've seen Chris do this, but as another example of this, R.C. Sproul, in his book, Rejected by God, or Chosen by God, says, to say that God foreordains all that comes to pass is simply to say God is sovereign over his entire creation. Okay? He also says the following in Chosen by God. The idea that God foreordains all that comes to pass is not an idea unique to Calvinism. It isn't even unique to Christianity. It's simply a tenet of theism, a necessary tenet of theism. So in other words, if you're a theist, you've got to believe this, because that's just a part of who God is. Nice try, Sproul. Sproul's great. He's a great mind. I've been encouraged by him a lot. He's just, nice try, Sproul, but that's not the truth at all. If that's not the case, it's not a necessary tenet of theism, clearly, because I don't believe in the sovereignty of God in that way. Okay, now here's what's going to happen. Someone's going to say, then that's just simply not sovereignty. This is not true. And for an example, I'm going to use this. I'll use this as an example. Predestination. Imagine someone doing that with predestination. Okay, imagine someone saying, listen, you don't believe in predestination. By the way, I believe in predestination. I just don't believe in the Calvinistic model of predestination. You see, there are Calvinists who have different shades and different understandings of predestination. There are some Calvinists that would posit, that would suggest that there's a double predestination, and that both of those, that some are predestined to eternal life, some are predestined to damnation, and that both of them are active. God is active in predestining both of them. Others, such as Sproul and others, would have what they would refer to as a positive-negative model that would say God actively chooses to predestine some to salvation and moves on their behalf, while simply passing over and allowing the others to go their way. See, those are two different models. But you know, the extreme Calvinists that believe in a double predestination could very well accuse Sproul or others and saying, listen, if you don't believe in double predestination, guess what? You don't believe in predestination. Period. Because the reason why is because there's only one option. When it comes to predestination, there's only one option. Well, clearly that's not the case, because there are different people debating the nuances of predestination. Similarly with sovereignty, we're debating the nuances of exactly what the sovereignty of God looks like, how He chooses to exercise His sovereignty. That's at the heart of the debate here. Okay? And by the way, this is the reason why, because there's only one option for the sovereignty of God in the minds of the Calvinists. That's why it is that I say that Calvinists have a small view of the sovereignty of God. And I know that I'm being, poking at a hornet's nest right there, because I know that a lot of Calvinists hold high their view of the sovereignty of God. And that's like criticizing Mormons for their lack of, for being weak on family values. Which I've done, by the way. Good way to upset a Mormon. So listen, quite simply, there are other options, and to say otherwise is just not true, and it's trying to establish and control the debate. Okay, on to the third point, and that is that God causes everything. Around 12 minutes and 20 seconds, he calls on Romans 8:28, and he says, we know, he's quoting from Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for the good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purposes. And then he comments, notice how the text says God causes all things. According to this text, what happens is caused by God. This right here is what I'm going to be centering the most of the future of the debate on, because this right here is the heart of where I believe that the Calvinists are way off on this and straying into areas that are totally unbiblical. Does this passage say that God causes all things? Sure it does. If you don't read the whole verse, okay? If you take it out of context. Here's what it says. We have one of two options within this verse. Either A, God causes all things, or B, He causes all things to do something. There's a big difference there. God causes all things, or God causes all things to do something. Well, fortunately, we're not left to wonder which one He means, because He says that God causes all things to work together. That's what He's doing. He's causing all things to work together. And by the way, this idea here is mentioned in other versions, like the King James, okay? Because earlier manuscripts don't even have cause in there. Other like King James, reading from the King James Version. And we know that all things work together for the good to them that love God. All right, there we go. We know that all things work together for the good. We know that all things work together for the good. It's not God causing all things. God causing all things? You know what? It sounds good at first, but there's a lot of repercussions to that we're going to be exploring in this. There's a lot of questions that raises that we're going to explore in further dialogue. But and by the way, this idea that God works all things together for the good, that God causes all things to work together for the good, Chris, how he interacts with that idea there is trying to employ a reductio ad absurdum by making that idea look silly. And by the way, it's a reductio ad absurdum fail. It's an epic fail here, because what he says is something like this: this people that say that He's working all things, causing all things to work together for the good, He's just kind of doing what He can to hold things together, scrambling to make things work. Chris is trying to paint a picture of God, mock this idea about saying, God's just doing everything He can just to try. If you lose your job, then He's doing what He can to just try to make it work together and keep everything together. Man, that's just he's trying to reduce it to the absurd. Now that picture is absurd, right? But that's not the picture. The nice thing here is, guess what? God does this effortlessly. Effortlessly. Now, here's the question that this brings up. And I'm running up on time. But if God causes all things, does God cause sin? Does God cause sin? Does God cause evil? Is God the cause? Is God the author of sin? Is God the author of that? That's the question. If so, then it would appear that He Well, I'm going to have to call it at that. We'll interact on this more.